Hi, everybody. It's 1:30. And I think we can turn things over to our moderator for the final panel, which is my colleague Laura Pinn. And Laura, introduce us to the panelists.
That's great. Okay, well, I'm so excited and so pleased and so honored to have the opportunity to moderate this final panel, which is featuring a group of people who all have involvement with Kitchener's Lived Expertise Working Group. I will invite the folks who are here on the Lived Expertise Working Group end to introduce themselves and if they would like to share their pronouns.
Yeah, thank you all. We're excited to be here. We have a fourth person who is from the city of Toronto. They're the city of Kitchener. They're City of Kitchener staff. They'll be joining us any second. So if you see them, grab them. They'll provide that perspective as well. I am David Alton, and I use the pronouns they, them, and I will introduce
Char.
And then
Julian, they, them.
Yeah, so that's our squad we have here today.
Wonderful, thanks for that. And so, David, my understanding is you're a facilitator, and Julian and Char are lived expertise consultants and experts.
That is correct.
Okay. Right off the bat, and I will have an eye for Andrew. I'm trying to have an eye on the guest list for when Andrew gets here, so I can bring him into the conversation. I was wondering if, sort of as a first question, if one of you could just give a real quick explanation of what the Lived Expertise Working Group is.
If it's okay with these guys, the Lived Expertise Working Group is 12 people in the city who, for some reason, have fallen through the cracks in the system. And the purpose of the Lived Expertise Working Group is to push from within to fight against the hegemony that is going on right now, where the hegemonic view is the view of those who have power, whether that be through race, through gender, through ability, through money, through housing, lack of money. Most of us, particularly me and Char, are involved in different tent cities, and it's not just us 12. Every one of us is tied to another group. So when we come and we talk, we go back to our groups and talk about what the group of 12 said. I call it the group of 12 because it sounds mysterious, like the group of 12. But and then that way we plug in those people. And the idea is nothing about us without us. That if we're going to talk about drugs, as Hunter S. Thompson said, the druggies must be represented. If we're going to talk about poverty, poor people must be represented. If we're going to talk about race, racialized people have to be represented. And we recognize that the problem is systemic. Does that wrap up?
Yep. Perfect. Exactly.
And just I guess from the logistical side of things, we exist as a 2-year pilot project funded through the City of Kitchener's affordable housing strategy. They're why am I blanking on the name of the affordable housing strategy? We're funded through that program. Housing for All, that's the name of it, the Housing for All strategy. And we're supported and incubated by the Social Development Center of Waterloo Region. So it's a partnership between Social Development Center of Waterloo Region and the City of Kitchener to bring together these 12 voices and work directly with the city.
Okay. Those affordable housing strategies. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And the region.
Yeah, we do a bit of cross-jurisdictional engagement as well.
With the region, right? Because of course, Kitchener is a 2-tier municipality. You've got the city government, and then you've got the regional government as well. I was going to say that those affordable housing strategies always have the nicest names. They're always just such pleasant names that we could all agree would be wonderful if they happened, but don't necessarily in practice. That's another story. Picking up on this theme of lived expertise, I'm wondering if each of you be comfortable sharing how you understand lived expertise, what that is, because I think there's a lot of misconception around that idea.
Let's start from there.
Okay, so I just feel like it's people that have been in either in one of the systems dealing with homelessness themselves, as well as on the ground, like giving back, volunteering, working with that community. So I feel like we pretty much started, in a tent ourselves and then worked our way up kind of thing. So that's where the expertise part comes. And I don't know, you just have to be passionate and have emotion for it. Because if you're not, you won't get anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think the definition we used at the selecting committee level for like how we chose the 12 people was we were looking for people with lived experience, as well as advocacy experience, and as well as connection and accountability to a broader community. And so those were kind of the 3 factors that were used in considering the development of this kind of group and this framing of expertise that's beyond just having lived experience.
The reality of the situation is we live in a neoliberal austerity economy. And as such, for those who have power and wealth, people have to have no power and wealth. For that to happen, people have to be dehumanized. People have to be called junkies, like myself, for example, or bums. And, like you have this image made up. Lived expertise is people who are living through that and take the extra step to fight back for inclusion. Nothing without us, nothing about us without us. That the idea of the solutions to the problem don't come from those who create the problem, because the housing problem's been going on forever. The drug problem before opioids was crack and people were dying. When I was in a coma for 1 year in the hospital, I came back, 75% of like my organizers and friends died. So the idea is that these people who are thrown outside of society, these people who are demonized and who are fighting back, these are the people with lived expertise because they live in a community, and within that community, they need to survive. And in order to survive, they need to make relations with others. And eventually this will lead to questions like, why are we sleeping in tents? Why are we going to jail for possession of a narcotic when a doctor gave me this for 20 years and all of a sudden there's this big panic and all my medicine is lost? Why am I beaten up because I'm Native or Black? Why do the police shoot me, like in the case of Bo Baker, when their mothers call for a suicidal intervention and there's 30 seconds between the sound of the police siren and the gunshots? So the lived expertise are people who've lived through stuff, who've seen stuff, who go to their community, organize their things to their community, ask their questions, and try to bring more people with lived expertise so that we become the issue. We don't become an other, that people other us. We state our agenda and we state our platform.
Mm-hmm. What I really love about that, those last points you were making, Julian, was the way that it connects to the idea of housing as a human right, which is something that hasn't been a focus of much of the conversation today, but I think is underlying some of the concerns and some of the motivations that we take in approaching housing policy. So this idea that we shouldn't be thinking about who is deserving and undeserving, but that housing is a human right, everyone deserves housing, and people deserve to make claims to be involved in policy decisions around housing. So I really appreciate that. Thank you.
And I want to go into this issue of deserving, poor, and unpoor. I have a lot of health issues and I have a lot of medications. Like I'm supposed to take 27 hydros for an hour in my veins and stuff. Whenever I go to the hospital for one of my heart attacks, they look at my arms. 1 second. They see the scarification on my arms and they treat me like a junkie until I bring up, sorry, I'm wearing a tight shirt today, but you can kind of see. Anyways, the point is, when they see my arms, they treat me one way. And then when they bring up my file and see I have heart conditions, I have cancer, I have this, I have that, whatever, then I get the, oh my God, who are you? Whereas before, when they just look at my arms or my neck, they'll just dismiss me, right? And like, you know, most people don't get the poor or whatever. Most people are like, you chose this life of heroin. They don't bring in the fact of the Oxycontin crisis, that most of the people that were 60% of Oxycontin users in Kitchener during the crisis were workers. Most of them were under the table workers. And I think half of those were migrant workers. So you get these people, you work the hell out of them, you throw them away, you give them a pill, then the pill company Purdue, which also owns the National Post, creates this big crisis, and then they have the solution of a non-addictive Oxycontin. Meanwhile, people are being demonized, people are being, you know what I mean, this and this. No one wakes up and says, I want to be a junkie. No one wakes up and says, I want to go steal something. Theft and the black market exists because the market cannot supply the needs of the people. So if you look in Eastern Europe and in Cuba now with the blockades, you see there's a lot of black market for food. You see there's a lot of black market for gasoline. It's because the economy cannot provide it. The reason there's a fentanyl crisis, the reason there's an opioid crisis is because there's a black market, because the market itself cannot provide it, because the people that the market needs to provide it are not thought of as people. They're thought of as something other than people.
Yeah, I think this is a good reminder about how homelessness, it's something that's a systemic failure of multiple systems, failure of healthcare systems, failure of safe supply, failure of housing system as well. I want to go back to talk a little bit about the role that the Lived Expertise Working Group serves in terms of its role with the city of Kitchener in informing housing policy. I mean, another way of putting this is, why is it necessary that this group exists?
Yeah, why is it necessary that this group exists? I guess I can start, but you.
Why are you here? What are you doing?
I know you all have answers. Oh, perfect. Andrew's here as well as David, another David.
Oh, good, Andrew. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for being here. It's good to see you. I'm so glad that you're here for this question as well. I wanted to ask, you know, and I'll maybe give you a moment. I don't know if I want you. Are you ready for a question? You are. Okay, so I'm going to put this right at you, Andrew. Here from the city of Kitchener. Why does the Lived Expertise Working Group exist? From your perspective, working with the city of Kitchener, like, why is there a need for this type of group? And then I'm going to put that question to the members of the Lived Expertise Working Group as well.
Sure. So I'm going to be clear, like the idea for this group did not come from me. It did not come from many city staff. It actually came from folks like Charles, like I see Charles here. It came from folks like Alex, who had gone to the community. Sorry, let me reframe that. The city has gone to the community multiple times over, you know, the past 40 years on issues like this, right? We've been told that there's a housing crisis. We've been told there's a drug epidemic. There's, you know, all these things. And, you know, we go to the community, we ask a question, we kind of, you know, take it like in our little survey format that we usually do on Engage WR. We take that information, and then people often don't know where it is, and they don't know how to influence this decision. So, and we do that over and over again. We do it point in time. So we do it, and then we forget about it. In 2 more years, we go back out and ask the same question. And it's like, oftentimes folks who have the most at stake and folks who have the most knowledge on this often feel like the conversation is not continuous, right? It's point in time. So in order for the right to housing to even happen, you have to have continuous conversations with folks who are the most affected, right? So it's not about coming to folks and engaging right before we go to council, right? Which is often what we do at the city, like, to be fair, for a bunch of different reasons, budgetary, time, a bunch of different things. But in this case, we say, let's change things. Let's model how we think we ought to do this kind of work. And that's where we are. So when, you know, the idea here is that when folks, when this group becomes more established, you know, folks around the city, for example, won't just come here before they go to council. They'll come here at the beginning of their process to get information. They'll, you know, help scope broader engagement with this group. They might come back midway through and then right before they go to council again. And the idea is that this group also has the kind of foundation of being something that is like quasi part of the city and quasi not a part of the city, so that when they do delegate to council, they do carry some sort of weight to them. Like not to say that folks didn't before, but when you say you're a part of the Kitchener Lived Experience Working Group and you have a staff member like me speaking and vouching for that group, council tends to listen a little bit more. Council tends to say, this is a group that we approved. So like we ought to listen to them, right? So I think it's about knowledge building on both ends, like both from the city perspective, as well as folks who are on this group, and building the capacity so that they are able to participate in processes more equitably, right? Like this group and the members of it are able to, a lot of folks here are able to even participate because they're being paid for their work, right, and for their participation. Whereas our advisory committees and our boards, you're not paid, and you're often having to give up 3-hour blocks of time once a month, which is quite frankly a luxury for most people. So this is a new way that we're modeling things. This is one working group where we're doing this. I know the city's also piloting it on another advisory committee, but all the learnings from this are they should change how the city operates, right? So that's my hope. That's why I think this needs to work. But also, if we want to be successful, we can't have, like, I kind of was in when Julian said, like, nothing about us without us, and that's true. Like, how can I, someone who's never been homeless, make decisions based on housing related policy, right? If I've never been affected, like I wouldn't know all the things that these folks know. So I think that's why it's necessary.
Yeah, thanks for that, Andrew. And I neglected to mention you're the social engagement and affordable housing lead with the City of Kitchener. I think I got that title right. So what I'm hearing is really driven by a need to, first of all, recognize barriers in existing engagement processes where they're not equitable, they're not, accessible to everybody. And second, to institutionalize some sort of connection with lived expertise, so it wasn't constantly these one-off efforts. I'm trying to connect with people, ask the same questions, but trying to institutionalize that a little bit at the city. I want to flip it back over to the working group members to sort of ask, from your perspective, what's the purpose of this group? Why do you exist?
Okay, Char wants to go first.
Hi. I personally love this group because, one, I also helped Andrew, forget to mention me all the time, start this group with the Alex questions and stuff at the beginning. But no, I like this group because every one of us that are on this group comes from a different place, like a different part of the, I don't want to say spectrum, but different part of the ladder, I guess you'd say, right? So I feel like we have so much knowledge, right? And when we bring it together as one group, it explodes, right? In a good way, not in a negative way, in a positive way. So not only do we leave each group knowing something that probably wouldn't have made sense if it wasn't explained by the person that explained it, and we have so much more knowledge now that this group is here, because there's stuff like I'm learning about, and I've been in this since, like, for 26 years, I've been working with homeless people, right? And I'm learning stuff that I had no clue about, right? So this group is not only bringing all the different programs and just even age group, like there's a variety of ages on this group too, right? So there's different like outlooks and there's different perspectives and just different way of thinking about it in this group. And I think like the more we get to learn about each other, the more we're growing as a human and as people. And I really like it. Okay. Okay.
That's great.
My bonus now? No.
Julie, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Okay, so what is the purpose of this group? I've been an activist for most of my life. I grew up in a 2-bedroom apartment with 15 people, moms, dads, 6 brothers and sister, aunts, uncle, anyone who comes to from the village, that sort of thing. I've lived on and off the streets, blah, blah, blah. The reality of the situation is Canada has no working class party. And when I talk about the working class, I'm also talking about the homeless, because gathering like cans to like buy something, that is labor, you know what I mean? Doing whatever homeless people have to do to survive is labor that is necessary to the city. Migrant labor is labor that is necessary. So we always have these groups that meet and make the decisions that affect all these people. And we're just told to be invisible and shut up. And then the question becomes evolution versus revolution. Which party do we vote for? Do you want to get shot in the arm or do you want to get shot in the leg? This is a chance to try to center us for once, instead of centering like the condos, instead of centering the issues of academia, instead of centering gentrification. So this group gives us a chance not just to center us, but to center the issues that we represent, the homeless, the drug addict, those who are seen as nothing, but in many ways create a lot of stuff for society. And yeah.
And I was just gonna jump in. I think something that I see really valuable about this group is because of there's such a diversity, like people talk about housing, the housing crisis or homelessness in such this pan way that like you can amalgamate all these different people. But what's very visible to me in this group is that we are filled with communities of lower income people, and they're so diverse communities of unsheltered people. And so this group allows us to bring a selection of those communities together and to really try and relate with each other, and to create that space to do that with city bureaucrats is really fascinating to find. How do we actually communicate to each other, outside of the limitations of our role, outside of the limitations of political power? Instead, we're here in this circle together and we're trying to find capacity to relate. And so to me, the relationships and the diversity of relationships coming together is really magical about the group, and that's why I'm really glad it exists.
One thing quickly.
Okay.
One thing quickly. One of the issues with Marxists that I have is that they have this image of the proletariat that will come and save everything. Really, the proletariats are alcoholics. The proletariats work under the table 24 hours. They don't have time to sit around and read books. The proletariat is not perfect. They've probably been abused. They've probably been beaten. They probably have beaten. They probably have stolen because of scarcity. So Marcuse tried to remove the proletariat and put instead the students, and we saw what happened with the Weather Underground, this and this and this. The importance of this group is we are bringing the proletariat, warts and all, to the front lines and saying this is what the proletariat is. We might be a bunch of fucked up people, we might have a lot of fucking issues, but this is reality, and you can't substitute reality with magical thinking.
Actually, I just want to jump in on that, because I think it's not just the warts and all of the proletariat. Like I would think, Andrew, it is an opportunity for you and other city staff to share a little bit about your warts that you're dealing with as well, which I think helps with the process.
Yeah, I think there's always a disconnect between the people we serve and the people and bureaucrats, right, in the city. So there's some days, and the working group members can tell you, there was the other day I walked in and everyone kind of was blah, at me, and I was no, that's not how it works. But also this is what I face when I try to do something internally, the structures of which I have to actually get through. And if you folks at the university, it's almost the same structure, right? You have some sort of governance level. We have council, we have senior leadership, we have our directors and managers. So it's for a good idea to come through, it has to pass through all of those mechanisms, right? So just getting folks to understand what it takes for a good idea to even come to fruition.
Oh, sorry. I think I accidentally paused the recording when I was just going to try and pull up. Thanks for that, Andrew. My mind is buzzing in about 4 different directions. So thank you for the reflection on the layers that ideas have to come through. And what I really took from the response to this question is just from what Char was saying, as well as the others, the richness of the knowledge that exists. That there's so much, and I've seen this in my own work as well, right? We have on paper how policy programs are supposed to work, and then we have how they actually work in practice. And it's really hard to have that knowledge to identify the different, the disconnect. And then that piece around, a lack of representation, and not just thinking about engagement mechanisms, but also thinking about political parties. And I think this actually goes back to the election platform discussion, or the Ontario election, talking about how actually on housing policy, the 3 parties were really close together. And again, speaks to that diversity, that the absence of diversity of policy approaches in mainstream political parties. I also want to note that Heather Majuri has posted in the chat about the importance of acknowledgement as well as intercultural exchange at a class level. Not to put you on the spot, Heather, but if you want to say anything else about those ideas, I'd welcome your input.
Oops. I don't have a lot to say. I just thought I'd add that to the thing. It's fabulous listening to everybody. I really, really value, oh my God, I value this group of humans so much. And I feel honored to be a part of this group.
Thanks for that. And I will say it's just such a pleasure hearing a bit more about the work the group's doing, as I've known about it sort of on the edges. I have 2 more questions, and then maybe we can open it up for a general Q&A. And one of them I'm going to direct towards Andrew, if that's all right. And I want to ask you about the challenges, barriers, and successes in terms of getting this group, first of all, implemented as a pilot project, and then the potential of making it more permanent. So, I'll phrase this by saying, from my perspective, this sort of initiative in partnership with a municipality is very unusual. And so one of my curiosities is like, how did you manage to squeeze this, make this happen? And then do you feel that it's likely to continue after the pilot period?
Yeah, so you're correct. So first of all, cities do everything kind of that seems to be funky as a pilot. We'll always like say something's a pilot because it gets council, it gets the public very comfortable with the idea that this is a little bit radical and outside of our bounds. So you'll always see that with city stuff. It'll say pilot, we're going to pilot this. But yeah, so that's number 1. But number 2, you're also correct in that this is very unusual for a municipality to do. I don't know of any other municipality that's done it to the extent that we've done. Toronto has tried to do it. Calgary, I think, has tried to do it. They've done it internally, but what we've done is actually partnered with a not-for-profit because we know that we can't build the same structures that the not-for-profit has in the community. So it's almost like leveraging social capital, but also getting them to help us like with our work and getting them, you know, the legitimacy that not-for-profits often seek, and to build a structure of, you know, people's knowledge going into decision making. So that's where we saw the value, but also just simply that nobody trusts the city. Like nobody trusts the city, right? Like I'm going to be clear, this is not just a City of Kitchener thing. This is all cities. This is all institutions. So how can we go forward with an idea like this and expect people to react positively just right away? So that's kind of why we saw that value, and the work that SDCWR does to begin with. Like we said, like, let's get in there, let's do this. And it also helped to, you know, not to say like we had a bad relationship, but many cities have bad relationships with not-for-profits. So we said, like, we actually need each other, right? We're at a point of division in society that we need to actually start to reach out to do that work. And just one more point, and I'll move on to the next part. But you know, Leilani Farha, who did a talk here at Kitchener, was so interested by this because she said, this has never been done in Canada. She said, this is a model that I would love to like learn more about and tell other municipalities that this is what's happening. So she came to one of our meetings, was like mind blown. And she's like a really famous human rights lawyer. So I was like, wow, like this is interesting. So that was cool. And the complexity of getting this started and how it got started, like to be quite frank, like we had said we want to implement the right to housing, right? Which is a very big and bold thing to do. Like, and I don't think council quite understood what that meant when we said that. So it was me, and at the time, someone named Karen Cooper, who worked with us, lovely person. And we said, this is the right to housing, you know, this is whatever. That means something in a different context today that I'm trying to get people to wrap their minds around as well. But in order to actually implement the right to housing, the people who are most affected have to be there making decisions, right? So that's what we said, and we made this like advisory committee, which some folks had sat on. I know Alex sat on. It was, to be quite frank, very messy. Advisory committees can be very messy. There's a lot of power dynamics. We had counselors there, we had developers, not-for-profit housing operators, people with lived experience, like at the time, and it was wild. It was like herding cats. People were crying, like we didn't have the supports to like actually support someone when things went wrong. So we said, let's just like remove all the power dynamics and let's get the actual folks who like need to like be in the room while we're doing this and speak to them on what the experience, you know, why couldn't they participate fully? Well, I had to worry about my child. Like when the pandemic happened, I remember people were crying in the rooms. They're like, I can't afford childcare. Like I can't afford to sit on this anymore. You know, I can't afford to get here. I can't afford to whatever. So it's honoring the work that they were doing. Like they were doing a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of emotional work, right? And it's also about valuing that. So I think that was a hard challenge, but the city was also at the same time going through an EDI process, which you might know. So it actually came at the right time. We did it before, I want to say. We did it before that. But they've also followed suit and saying we can't expect people who are the most affected to be doing the most work and also not be paid or recognized for that. So yeah, it took a lot, but I got rubber stamped and I got approved for 2 years. And the idea is that by the end of the 2 years, we come back and say, this is the value, this is the work that we've achieved. I'll have to go to council to ask. So as long as we can do that, like perhaps, right? Like there's a bunch of other things that have to fall into line. Like we also leveraged funding from the federal government, which was hard to get as well. So I think if all those come together again, I don't see why we can't. Like I think this is a crucial time in history for housing, as we can see. Like, so it would be helpful to continue it, right? So.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm hearing so many important factors. The existence of a community partner with relationships in community like the SDC, the availability of some funding, taking advantage of the prominence of right for housing and EDI discourse, at least in municipal governments, to open up some space. So I really, lots to think about there. I do want to note that I see a lot of, well, first of all, I think I saw a hand, Julian. I wanted to ask if David, Julian, and Char have anything they'd like to add. And then I know Alex is here as the executive director of SDC and not formally on this panel, but I will also ask if you have anything you want to add about how this working group came to be. I think your perspective would be really valued.
We can do two things. We can either compare to Cambridge or Muskoka. So Kitchener has a history of activism. In the 70s and 80s, the MLs took over the newspaper and they created the Chevron. In the 90s, Zundels was here. We created anti-racist action with Toronto. Now all you hear is Trump talking about Antifa, but we chased them out. We created the first youth-run youth drop-in center in the country without 1 penny from the government. We've been doing tent sitting and gang people housing since the 90s. We wanted a safe injection site. We set up in front of the regional building tents where we got on the lock zone training and we shot up. And like, yeah, and like we have to look at the fact that communities outside will organize, and a community that has a history of working class. And when I talk about working class, I also include the homeless in this because they do work, you know, and the most vulnerable. Where there's resistance, the city will eventually be willing to sit and talk. Then you have a country like a city called like Muskoka or Cambridge, which doesn't have this history, has double the rate of overdoses. You have groups of people a couple of years ago that will go around in Cambridge burning tents. You have people getting yelled at for helping homeless people in Cambridge. Several years ago, they didn't want the Sanguine van, which is a community like health mobile, to go into Cambridge. And we have the same things in Muskoka. And they both have a very industrialized base, and although now Muskoka's going more towards the come and like look at our water thing. So the question is, what's the difference between Cambridge, Kitchener, and Muskoka? Kitchener, the working class, and I'm not talking about the unionized working class, which makes up 2% of the population. I'm talking about the low of the low that collect beer cans and shit. The working class has resisted. And the city realized that the working class will not go away. In Cambridge, on the other hand, you have reaction funded by the city, and the same in Muskoka. They think that if we hide it under the carpet, it will go away. And that's what the difference is. Andrew wants us all to sit together, and we're willing to sit together because the right to have a roof over your head is a right to exist. And we've learned our right to exist comes from our right to resist. And so we are willing to get there because people, when they started Food Not Bombs, stood up against police, and it was the homeless people that fed themselves. Food Not Bombs would not be around if that didn't happen in '98. Land back, they took over the park, you know. There's a huge history of Indigenous resistance here as well, and that's important because we're a settler colonial society, and the only solution is a Louis Riel solution. Well, there's other solutions, but the one that, you know. Anyways, the point being, resistance of the people leads to dialogue. And one last statement, in the 60s, the IRA, because I was involved with the political dissidents, the IRA, they were like interning people, shoot to kill, whatever. No one gave a fuck until they started letting off bombs in Britain. Then Britain started talking about the Irish problem. Same in South Africa. No one cared about apartheid until SWAPO and Winnie with her matches.
Yes, thank you for the history lesson, Julian. Well, I think we'll pass it back to Laura and see where the conversation goes.
Okay, yeah, thanks for that, Julian. I think it's the importance of working class struggle, broadly defined working class. And I chuckled a little bit at your union comment because we're a union household over here, but I fully agree with it. I fully agree. That's another conversation. I might just say, Alex, do you have anything you want to add about the process of making space for the Lived Expertise Working Group as a partnership supported by the City of Kitchener and SDC to exist?
I just can say that it's a history of the organization where community work in communities, self-determination, self-help, resistance, those things have always been recognized as motivators for the organization. And our struggle was how to create bridges. So we were typing bridging work through our history so that different sides can hear each other, and particularly that voices such as Land Back, Black Lives Matter during the pandemic, that there's a whole surge of initiatives, grassroots initiatives that came to the forefront and had a lot to do with convergence of other things, Laura, that you mentioned. So it's kind of no way of just going back, right, into doing same old, as Andrew was describing. And I think it's really important, and it can also be used if researched as a motivator to even more broadly engage segments of population to understand that in so many respects we cannot and we won't go back, and the diversity of voices that rounds around those thoughts is growing. The slightest trend during the pandemic of homeowners, middle class folks joining in these conversations. I was promoting them. I was mentioning it at any meeting I would be with, be it city, be it region, just to start creating this ground where the dialogue will happen. So it's on all of us.
Great, thank you for that, Alex. I want to open it up to general comments and questions, and then I do have one more question. I'll ask it if we have time at the end. And I saw Nadine, I see you raised your hand. Nadine, do you want to introduce yourself, and please go ahead.
Hello, hi, my name is Nadine Green. I live and work at a better tent city. I'm just outside my tiny home. I am happy to be a part of the Live Expertise group. Can you hear me?
Yes.
There's a lot of background noise. I'll go over here. So as I was saying, I'm happy to be a part of the Lived Expertise group and to be a voice for a better tent city with people living and experience homelessness. Well, we're not homeless anymore because we live in these tiny homes, but just to be a part of the group is amazing. Working with David, Julie, and Char, Alex, and everyone in the group, Heather. And it's just a wonderful thing.
Well, that's great. Thanks, Nadine. And for those that aren't familiar, a better tent city is what I would call in one sentence, the only sanctioned encampment site in Ontario, possibly in Canada. It's a site of tiny homes where about 50 folks live, and Nadine's on site right now. Any other questions or comments for the working group members? Or Andrew, I'm not sure if I should refer to you as a member or like a supporter, or you're kind of a member.
I do say I'm a member. Okay. This. Yeah, we sit in a circle. Like, if that makes any sense.
It does make sense. Yeah, it's like a non-hierarchical you're a member. So, any questions for the working group members? from the audience? Allison?
Thanks, Laura, and thank you to everybody. This has been such an amazing panel. It's rare that I've sat through an entire day of panels and feel like this energized at the end of it. You guys have been so great. I have so many questions, and I so appreciate this opportunity to hear from you. Thank you. So thank you all so much. I think that there's like some bumper stickers that we need to make, like Julian, the solutions to the problem do not come from those who create the problems. Like we should just put that on a bumper sticker. It was so good. I also, Char, you also said there's so much knowledge when we bring it together, it explodes. Like these are just like cross stitch it and put it in City Hall, whatever. So thank you all so much. This is really great. So the question that I have is that to the extent that there have been partnerships, it's oftentimes with like an alliance to end homelessness, like the Toronto Alliance to End Homelessness. And this is like service providers who have sort of banded together under this organization. And to the extent that the city of Toronto anyways is like willing to share a little bit of power, it's with like an alliance to end homelessness. It seems to me that this type of a partnership, exactly because of the way Julian articulated it, seems so much like there's just so much more knowledge, so many more ideas that can come from this type of a partnership and of an alliance. But I'm just wondering if any of you might comment on if you've had any experience working with one of those, like an alliance to end homelessness, and if you might sort of think about why those have been more common in terms of partnerships than lived expertise groups. I have kind of my sort of suspicion, but I would love to hear from you about this.
That's a great question. Thanks for that, Allison. I see Andrew's hand, and then Nadine, is that a legacy hand, or do you have something on this question as well?
I don't have anything to say. I think my hand is still raised. I'm
Your
trying
hand's
to take it
up.
down.
Okay, so I see Andrew, and then I see Heather.
Yeah, so one thing I did a lot of engagement in the housing strategy, which was really hard during a pandemic. It was really hard, but it was, I tried my best to go into, shelter systems with folks. And that was another thing too, that I would never do again, the way I did it. But, in speaking to service providers, you hear one thing, right? Like and it's not to say service providers are bad. They do the work of things that we are never willing to do. Like they do really hard work, they do grueling work, but at the end of the day, it's at a high level, right? Like when you actually speak to people who have to use those services, you hear a different story, right? So like, for instance, one of the providers here, I'm not going to name which one of them, but some of the policies work against, folks who use drugs, folks who have different needs than other community members. And it's like, well, a lot of the folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness are using drugs. So it's like, it puts conflict between service providers and the folks who actually need to use those services. So it's interesting when you speak to service providers, they say one thing and it might be very like pie in the sky. It might sound like very like tagline-y because they're a big organization, they're a big institution. There's many things I have to say as a city staff member, right? But when you speak to the folks who actually use those services and talk about how difficult it is to access those services, and just how spread out the services are and all those things, it's a different story. So I think it's really easy and it's low risk to partner with these organizations because they do have a lot of funding, right? I mean, relatively, they really don't have that much funding, but they have the mandate from the service managers, which in this case, in our region, is the region of Waterloo, who gives them money to operate. So Toronto is the same thing. Toronto would give them money to operate on their behalf because the city of Toronto doesn't administer many of their programs, right? Much low risk, it's very risky for a city to say, let's just bypass that and let's go straight to the people. It is very risky because we don't know how that will go. We don't know, like, we've never done it before. So I think that's why most people do that. But there is a danger in doing that, is that you hear one story, right? And many of those service providers who run their services have never themselves been homeless, right? So that's why it's important to go straight to people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I'm hearing less risky and potentially less conflictual as reasons why. Heather, and then I'll pull over to the lived expertise trio.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I'm kind of like that person who, is the president of the hair club for men. No, I've been on both sides of the desk. So I've been a client and I've been somebody who has been on the front line of services. And to me, the gap is when we only go to the service organizations, which are important. So I have nothing, there's nothing I have against a service organization. It's the other thing, there's a lot of polarity in the way people think. People have a tendency to go right, wrong, black, white, and the world to me has never really existed that way. So it's really important that if I'm making a criticism, that doesn't mean I'm against. And if I'm observing something, that doesn't mean that something's wrong or a gap or something like that, right? So that's really important to remember. I have empathy for both sides of the desk. But when we only engage with the service providers, to me, that is an extremely paternalistic approach. It's incredibly classist. And it doesn't, it takes another, it's another layering of the story. So I don't know if any of you guys have ever done the communications little exercise called broken telephone, but the more people in between the source and the receiver, the more distorted the message can become, because we're human beings and we filter those messages. And that's not anything against service providers, but they may have their own biases that they're not aware of. So when you engage with people actually having the experience, you're going to get that actuality that is required to know how to move forward. So that's my personal opinion on that. But it's always best when everybody's in those rooms somehow together and those voices are being respected at all levels, whether we agree or not at different times. So I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I'm hearing making space for direct conversations between people with lived expertise, and then also making spaces for honest and open conversation, including critique, right? And yeah.
And sometimes that can be very uncomfortable and difficult for all of us for different reasons. But if we can start to acknowledge, that's what I mean as well about acknowledging. You can't address what you don't acknowledge.
Yes.
And so often we are a society of looking good. And that society of looking good can often interfere with addressing the actual issues. So I think it's important to lay waste to looking good and start to build that authenticity. And I think a lot of things can be accomplished, and I'm going to shut up now.
That's a beautiful way to put it. We are slightly over time. I'm going to use my moderator privileges to abuse the schedule and give us until 2:20, because I want to give the last word to David, Char, and Julian. So please, this question of working with, well, I don't even remember where we started. We've gone so far, but hopefully you do.
Well, we'll try and be quick and each get a minute each. I think something that is very apparent now with housing being downloaded to the municipalities and the way that shapes the relationships with agencies, it creates the homeless ecosystem that is very stratified by like, not, I won't say power, but like everyone's fighting for the ability to have a seat at the table or to run a program. And so there's definitely a hierarchy of services, and at the bottom, and then outside that hierarchy, there is the immense amount of service provision that's not agency led, that's led by unsheltered communities, that's led by community groups, that are completely outside of that spectrum of like relationships and proximity towards housing providers like the region. And so I think that really, that's something that's very, I think, important to acknowledge within this homelessness and housing support ecosystem, is this kind of stratification of services and how that creates a hierarchy that shuts certain voices out of the conversation, even though they're all providing important supports and services for this crisis. And I'll pass now over to Julian for their minute.
Okay, so I think it's really unfair the way Nadine is being presented, in the sense that, first of all, no one handed Nadine a better tent city. Nadine had a store. Nadine had a store. She saw homeless people. She went out of her way to invite them in her store. I lived in her store. I ate her like, what was it, chocolate milk and like orange, strawberry milk. and marshmallow Cheerios. I still owe you for a bunch. And the city
Yes,
was
Adrian, you
suing
too.
her. The city was
Julian.
suing her. She'd go to court. We'd be like, wake up, Nadine, it's time for court. We go to court, blah, blah, blah. She won in court. She won. And
Well,
then,
I didn't really
what-
win. I lost the fight, but it was
well, you
okay.
lost finally, but the original document legally said you won. But then that other fucking guy pulled some
No
strings and
swearing,
you
Julian.
lost.
No swearing. No swearing.
Okay, but anyways, so there was huge struggle Nadine did. Nothing happens without struggle. And Char can tell you, or maybe she's not allowed to tell you a lot about.
I think
Do you-
Char's done now.
Do you want to talk about like your experience that nothing comes without struggle?
Nothing comes without struggle. That's just a given.
Okay, Char, last words for you.
Nothing comes without struggle. That's just a given. But like, yeah, Nadine did work hard, and so did you, Julian, and everybody on the group has worked hard to get to where we are today.
And it wasn't all, please write a letter to Congress or like your MP.
Mhm.
Years, right? Like she's had that for many.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I will say, unfortunately, Laura Hamilton ghosted us, so we didn't get to hear about a better tent city too much today. I'm coming for Laura. She better look out. I appreciate the note and the correction in tone where a better tent city really exists in spite of the region and in spite of the municipalities, from what I've heard, and not because of support they got, right? There was an eking out. I see your hand, Nadine. Like 30 seconds, 30
I'm
seconds.
just gonna say, so we just, we know what happened already, and we're not gonna blame anybody anymore. We just gonna move forward and help these people who are homeless to get into a home or to get into a tent or get into anything off the street, and that's our goal, and that's what we want to do. And there's room for forgiveness. Thank you. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks,
You go,
Nadine.
girl.
That's such a wonderful note to end this panel on. And it's so wonderful to have such great participation as well. I know I stretched the panel and brought other people into the conversation, and I appreciate your willingness to be brought in. But please join me in thanking the Lived Expertise Working Group members for being here.